Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Allen Adamson, co-founder and managing partner of MetaForce, an elite marketing collective of the industry's top talent. Allen's a noted industry expert in all disciplines of branding and marketing. He's worked with a broad spectrum of consumer and corporate businesses and industries ranging from packaged goods and technology to healthcare and financial services, hospitality and entertainment, and now higher education. Allen's appeared on ABC News, NBC's Today Show, and is often quoted in publication including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Forbes. Some of you may ask, why do I mention Allen's bona fides and have him on the show? Higher education currently has an oversupply of education institutions and an underdemand of students. And given that 98% of higher education institutions look the same and offer the same programs, it makes sense for us to look outside of higher ed to gain a deeper understanding of the important role branding and marketing play in creating sustainable institutions. And so Allen joins us today to share with us his perspectives on how higher ed institutions can break out of the pack to drive enrollment growth through branding and positioning.
Allen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation. You are an expert when it comes to marketing and branding, something that higher ed could use a little more help with. So let's get right into it. Give us a little background. I mean, when I read about your background, I was fascinated some of the things that you've done.
No one, I think, ever sets out their career to be an expert or, to focus on brand and maybe a little bit of marketing. So I originally thought I was going to be a filmmaker. And then when I started to starve because I wasn't as talented or as committed, I went back to business school and ended up starting my career in an advertising agency called Ogilvy & Mather, where we got to make little films called commercials. I wasn't allowed to touch those. The creative team did, but I got to hold my coffee on the set. And after a couple of years of that, decided to become a client, the other side of the agency, if you've ever watched Mad Men in the distant past. And I was at Unilever, which is a global packaged goods company. It was a great place to learn marketing because despite what I tried or what everyone tries to convince you, there's not that much difference between one product and the other on the shelf in the supermarket. You can't take soap on clean your face on one side and another soap and clean your face on the other side and say, oh my God, my right side is much cleaner than my left. So it's a good category because of the nuanced product differences targeted at various niches to learn how to differentiate and do marketing. So I spent many years doing that. And then I returned to the other side and worked with Procter & Gamble for a bit. And then a company called Landor, which does brand positioning and global branding for lots of companies and organizations. And I've been on my own now in my own firm, which does similar things for the last 5 years.
So when you look at, that's a fascinating background, by the way. I know the companies that you've talked about, and they are the creme de la creme when it comes to marketing and positioning for institutions. So when you look at the higher ed market, what do you see?
It's a classic situation where you have a lot of organizations that are doing many or everything right. But when you get to 30,000 feet and try to look at them and say, what's the difference between college A and college B or university A and university B? Now, while some of them have a big reputational lead, most of them are out of the same cooking recipe. They have a nice campus, they have a nice library, they have a little quad, their course curriculum is roughly the same, they have some really renowned instructors and professors, they talk the same about the student experience, they have dorms, they have different places students can eat, they have nice gyms and places to hang out. Sometimes they're attached to a local town. But, when you start looking at exactly what they do, they are incredibly similar. It's the same thing I find when we're looking at the difference between one smartphone and the other. They both have chips. The chips do the same thing. They both have screens. They both, have multiple apps you can download. The same thing with, you try to decide what type of car do you want. They both have coffee cup holders. They both have engines. They're both, when I get into a rental car, it's hard to tell if you're driving a Korean import or an American luxury car. It's incredibly similar. And I think that's where higher ed is today. They have lots of good, when we talk about brands, are they focused on telling what they do? Are they focused on telling how they do it? Or are they focused on telling who they are and what they believe in? And most are talking about what they do. And if you're just telling people what you do or what you have in it, your ingredients, you're made with natural dairy products or you're made with Intel chips, if you're only telling people what you do and what you do is 98% is the same as everyone else, you're going to be in a situation where I can't see the difference. So why do I have to pay any difference? And you get into a price situation. If I can't tell the difference between one soap and the other when I was a Unilever, I'm going to buy the store brand. I'm going to buy the cheaper. I'm going to buy the one on sale. And brand is all about creating something different that matters to consumers.
Well, what you just talked about to me is differentiation. How do you differentiate yourself from the other 3,600 different universities and colleges that are out there? Right now, we're facing declining markets. We've got an oversupply of higher ed. The enrollments are declining. We're seeing more and more institutions going out of business and merging. Higher ed hasn't learned how to differentiate itself. And I think a lot of that has to do with higher ed living inside its own bubble and not going outside to figure out who is good at what, and then being able to differentiate yourself based on external views versus internal views. Does that make sense?
It's very much the case. A book I wrote with a professor at NYU a couple years back, it's called Shift Ahead, and it explains why all these great companies are no longer here. Why every time you open a newspaper or listen to news, do you hear a renowned brand company organization has gone out of business? And so Professor Joel Steckel and I looked at that. And one of the concepts he likes to talk about, which I loved, is if you're going to be successful in avoiding being your father's Oldsmobile, one of the behaviors that gets organizations in trouble is they play, as he says, too much tennis and not enough golf. So what he means by that is you spend all your time, if you're playing tennis, and I play both badly, watching your competitor and saying, well, Allen is on the right side of the court. Let me try to hit it to the left side. No, Allen's moved to the right side. So you're preoccupied. And I found that when I worked at Pepsi, I was completely focused on what Coca-Cola did. When I worked at Unilever, I was just say in the cafeteria, did you see what Procter and Gamble did? And you get into this habit, if in any organization, of just watching the dry cleaner across the street. And if they offer you one sweater clean for one free one for every, you do the same. And I think the same happens in higher education. People go, oh my God, oh, look what this university is doing. They're offering free breakfasts on Thursday to students. Let's do that too. And so you get very myopic. Whereas if you play golf, yeah, you're somewhat worried about the people you're playing with, but you're really focused on which way the wind is blowing, how far you have to hit it, what the terrain is like. You got a much greater peripheral vision. You're looking outside of your category. And if you look at disruption in any business, very few companies get disrupted by their number one or two or three competitor. Gillette was winning in the razor blade business, and every year they came up. So now they has 3 blades, and then Schick made 3 blades, and then Gillette added 4 blades, and then Schick added 4 blades. And they were going at it. They were very myopically focused on the other guy. But at the end of the day, they got disrupted by Dollar Shave Club, or somebody says, why do the number of blades matter? What the real hassle is remembering to get the blades. So why don't you send them to me? So the same thing happens in higher ed. They're just looking at other universities, and they just copy them. And copying your competitor, unless you can dramatically outdo them, is usually a strategy to commodity land. And so part of what makes this hard for universities and colleges is that they are very attuned for what their peer set is doing, or what's written in, did you read this? And they did this at this university. And, they can maybe copy it, but it's unlikely they'll do it as well or better. And part of the other challenge is the more things you try to do, the more likely you'll be average at it. If I play both tennis and golf, I won't be as good if I pick one. I'll be better if I pick one and focus on it. And so there's a belief that, I'll just add this, or we'll just add a course in this, or we'll just do this, and that will be the answer. But throwing more things into the kitchen sink doesn't make the kitchen sink more desirable.
Yeah, it's a sea of similarity, as we talked about before. Is everybody looks the same? You're offering the same courses. Accreditation doesn't help matters with it. I have to be careful because I help institutions with accreditation. So I don't want to really get people angry. But when you submit a new program with accreditation, they want to know what are the other programs that you've compared it to, rather than saying, what are the student outcomes that you're going to get and how are they different than other institutions? So it's trying to keep you inside that same box.
Right. And so all this makes it harder because if you're only looking at your peers that do the exact same thing you do, occasionally trying to copy them, not really thinking out of the box, you have an offer that's very, universities are very complex experiences. It's like an airline or a hotel or a resort. One of the famous quotes from an airline CEO is, I can do 50 things right on a flight. The plane could work, the pilot could know where he's going, the food gets there on time. But if I do one thing wrong, lose your bags, spill coffee on you, then the experience is ruined. And same thing with a complicated university. You could have great professors, great buildings, lovely extracurricular activities, but that doesn't help you differentiate because ultimately there's so many things going into the experience that just by touching one thing does not necessarily change everything.
And a quote that you told me about from Steve Jobs, the most important decisions I made were no decisions. No, we're not going to do this. No, we're not going to do that. No, we're not going to position this way, because he wanted it to be a unique experience.
Right. And if you don't say no, then you're saying yes to everything, which sets you up to do everything averagely at best. And there's a quote we talked about from the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman. He says, average is over today. You can get cheap genius fast. You can get what you want. You can get a package delivered in 4 hours. If you're just doing everything averagely, especially on social media, no one shares, I had an average flight to LA, the pilot found LA, the bag sort of got there. No one shares. They either share the horrendous experience, and we won't go into what those are, or something extraordinary.
So you mean like a window blowing out, something like that?
Yeah, I was going to go there, but I decided maybe not. But so that gets shared, and somebody doing something phenomenal, saying, running after you, and you left your phone on the plane and coming all the way through the terminal to give it to you. Those things get shared.
Yes.
But everything in the middle doesn't get, because people don't share, I use this toothpaste and, it worked like almost every other toothpaste and I was pretty happy with it. And if you ask me how happy I was with your toothpaste, I'll say, I was really pretty happy with your toothpaste. But I won't share that on social media. And today, word of mouth is the most important marketing tool. And if you don't have people sharing, if other students aren't saying, I took this great class, it was phenomenal, I've loved my freshman year, young people are tuned to what other young people are saying. You're setting yourself up for trouble if you do everything sort of okay, averagely. But average is over. So pick a few things and do them extraordinarily well, because those have a higher likelihood of being shared on social media.
I saw a couple of commercials just recently by FedEx. They're talking about a couple were expecting their wedding rings and they didn't show up in time. They left a note on the door, FedEx delivered to the beach. And the FedEx driver did that. They showed up in time, etc. And then they had, it was done cartoon images, but then they had the actual FedEx driver there with that. That's showing extraordinary service. That's what higher ed needs to be able to do, is show how they're extraordinary over their competitors. Does that make sense?
More than sense. I had the privilege of working with FedEx for many, many years. And their brand promise, people think, oh my God, a big company like that, flying airplanes all over the world. What's their brand promise? The brand promise is absolute certainty. You go in to their office and you talk to a receptionist, do you have a place I can get a tuna sandwich? He or she will solve that. Absolutely certainly. They know the brand promise. And so they deliver that promise because all their employees follow this idea called the Purple Promise, which is about delivering absolute certainty and doing whatever it takes to delight their customer and surprise their customer and make sure they come through. There was a movie made many, many years ago with Tom Hanks called Castaway, and it was about a FedEx plane. It was made with the FedEx's cooperation. Unfortunately, has an incident and goes down on a deserted island, and he survives on the island with his FedEx boxes and his soccer ball. But then when he goes back to the U.S., he takes one package and drives to this little town that was damaged from the ocean and sand and delivers the package. And that captures the essence of FedEx. And that's why they have been successful, because they have a really focused brand story. But everyone in the organization, from the receptionist to the driver to the pilots to the people tracking the information, understands it and knows they have to deliver that every day. There are other post office can do it, UPS can do it, other people, DHL, but they are relentlessly focused on delivering that surprise. So when that person gets their wedding ring on the beach, they post the video and 2,000 people see it and go, oh my God, FedEx took it all the way to the beach from their doorstep. And that's a story that people remember and want to share.
You can't discount the power of social media, because students, prospective students, this is how they're getting a lot of their information. So if you're able to touch students in an area that makes sense to them, you've got a better than a prospective buyer. You have a very probable buyer.
You have a brand ambassador who's going to be out on the mountaintop saying, I went to college ABC and I was not a great writer, and now I am much more. I love my writing. I've decided to do this, and people are commenting on it. And that's more impactful than saying our English department has 14 great professors who've done this many years, have written this many papers. All that's important and necessary, but it's necessary but insufficient until you get to the student who says, this school changed my life.
Now, let's get into what higher ed institutions need to do to differentiate, because that's the key thing. Up to now, we've been talking about mostly corporate. I think that's good, because higher ed needs to look outside of itself to see how other industries are doing things to be able to bring those lessons in. So what does higher ed need to do to differentiate itself, or say one institution differentiate itself? Not a small question, sorry.
Yeah, as I was saying, it's easier said than done. The theory of this is easy. The execution is hard. And so while everyone knows how to do this, the people in the marketplace that are successful take the theory and execute it. Apple wasn't the first company with an iPad. HP had one. Dell had one. They were the first company to execute it brilliantly. And so take that as a warning that if we talk about here are the 4 steps you need to do this, even if you understand those 4 steps, none of them are easy, and getting them done right is hard. But the first thing to do is realizing that simple matters. And going back to FedEx, if you can't boil your core story down to a simple idea, that's a challenge. And the second piece is, if the only place you're looking to differentiate your story is on what you do, your ingredients, your engineering, your classes, your campus size, your number of trees on the quad, the companies that only focus on what they do are great if they have a what that's completely unique. When Apple came out with the iPhone, that was a what that was different. They didn't have to explain why it was better than the BlackBerry and using those keys. It was clearly a different experience. But most companies are faced, and most organizations, profits, nonprofits, are faced with a what story that's pretty much the same as everyone else. And if they're only searching in that area. Let's talk about our classes. It's a hard place to go. But even if you're starting with a you can't just have a litany of we are this many students, this many teachers, this many successful grads. You just listing the ingredients. While facts are interesting, but lots of these decisions need to go beyond the facts, because if you compare the specs of one car to the other or one smartphone to the specs look almost identical for everything around you in your life. But universities are still in the headset of talking about what they do, less about how they do it, how they put it together, even less about who they are from a belief and personality point of view, and even less about why they do it, their purpose or mission. So the category is grounded in a simple what story. It's a long story. So the step one, even if you're doing a what story, you got to boil it down to, we can tell them about everything here, but that won't get them more interested. What are the two things or one thing that's a good exemplifier of what we do going forward?
It's basically what you're telling me is to differentiate, you need to know what you're going to focus on and what you're
Right.
great at. Focus on that one idea, because you can't be great in all things and do everything for all people. And
exactly,
once you've got that figure out, a good example to me of that is Carnegie Mellon. 25, 30 years ago, they were a little university in Pittsburgh. Their president came up and said, we are going to be in the top 3 in the world in technology. And they focused on that. They changed their structures. They changed a lot of different things. And now when you take a look at Carnegie Mellon, it is one of the top 3 in certain areas of technology. It is very, very difficult to get into. You've got to basically ace your ACTs or SATs, great recommendations, etc. But when you go there, you are going to get a world-class education in the particular area of technology you want to get. And their website, their social media, everything reflects that.
Yeah. So part is the step would be you put up all the things you think could differentiate you, and then figure out, all right, so here are 10 things that could do it. Now, which of those 10 can we be great at, brilliant at? That's going to eliminate some of them. And then let's pick one. And that's the theory. That's the right way to do it. I'll talk about it in a second. That once you have that, then that relentless focus can go through. We talked about earlier when we met before, NYU, a story of how John Sexton, the president, when he came into NYU, went through this process between the business school, the med school, the dental school, the undergrad, the arts. They went through, and rather than talking about all the what's, they had all these programs and all these great things, and Washington Square, and he came up with an idea that said, much like Carnegie Mellon, we are going to be in and of the city. So other universities have walled gardens. We're going to be the university that really leverages what's around us and brings that to life and makes that real to our students. That simple idea, like absolute certainty, allowed them to compete on a completely different dimension than how many classes they had and how many degrees they gave out and how many buildings were clustered together and which one was famous and which ones were not. So that relentless focus on doing something, and then he drove that for years into signature programs, which paid that off. This program with Goldman Sachs, this program with whatever, around the university they tied in with or in Asia, because you can't just use words anymore. You have to have what we call in marketing a signature experience, a genius bar. If you say you're going to provide better service and a better experience, you just can't say that and then answer the phone call with somebody with a tech problem on ring 22 and put them on hold. You have to have a signature experience. And so for universities, it's incredibly hard to get to that focus, and we can talk about that in a second. But even if you get that focus, you need to figure out what's going to be this one or two signature. For example, here's what we do that will bring it to life. Otherwise, it's a bunch of words on your website or in your communication or catalog or brochure. And as we talked about earlier, young people don't read a lot. They don't do a lot of reading. They're much more interested in what happens on social media. And the funny thing about a signature experience, if some student writes about, I went to NYU and they had this incredible joint lab we did with the finance team at Goldman Sachs, that signature experience is what they'll share. They won't share the fact that there were 3 great professors who had a deep understanding of finance or all the other reasons. They will share that signature experience. So at the same time, what we often recommend is you're thinking about what your focus should be. Don't pick that focus until you can imagine 2 or 3 potential signature experiences or signature proof points that you're going to be able to do. So if you're going to say we're the best in service and you want to compete with Apple and you don't have Genius bars in every city, don't say it because you're never going to be able to deliver it. If you don't connect the imperative to the strategy, if we say this, we have to do this. And the organization says, I like this, because the people do it in a linear fashion. The university says, oh, let's stand for the best stand-up comics in town nearby our classes. If you can't execute it, it doesn't matter what you say. And so you end up approving the strategy. And then a year or 2 later, people say, gee, that sounded good on PowerPoint and in the meeting room. But, I don't think we can really afford to build a world-class blank, blank, blank.
It's interesting you bring that up, because when I'm thinking about institutions that I've talked to, that I've worked with, etc., Howard University comes to mind. They're one of the top HBCUs in the country.
Mm-hmm.
But they had a program, or have a program, where they send folks out as internships to Google, and they call it Howard West. This is a unique program that they have had. They're working on it, or they were about a year ago working on it with Amazon to get their computer science engineers practical experience. This is that unique experience that you talk about.
Right. So if you're thinking we offer the most unique experiences for our students, you put that in a brochure, it's white noise. People just, yeah. But if you tell one story, like last year we sent 30 students to Google to learn how to do this, I get it. And I want to share that. You should consider going to here, because look what they did with Google.
And then when you can back that up with social media, pictures, stories, etc., and you can publicize, we had a quarter of our people get hired by Google and other tech companies with similar names because they had this experience. You got yourself a winner.
Versus listing in your brochure, we have 12 classes on software engineering, 8 classes on programming skills, and have had a great track record of placing graduates in many, many industries.
So what do institutions have to do to figure out what their focus should be? Is it just putting a stake in the sand? Is it external? What is it?
It's also organizational, as we've also talked about, because Steve Jobs was a bit eccentric, and
Really?
he talked about being able to say no, but he also was really the decision maker. People would come into his office and say, that's crazy, you're in a different zone. He said, that's what we're going to do. And as you know, universities are consensus driven, lots of committees. And part of it is, even if getting to that, what's our focus, is going to be very challenging. Because when we work with law firms or big nonprofits, we're in a big conference room. I did some work many, many years ago with National Geographic, and was in Washington, lots of people from National Geographic, a whole room full. Everyone had been there 20 years. Everyone had an opinion. And when we talked about how to revitalize the National Geographic brand 20 years ago, you couldn't get anyone. The only thing they'd agreed on is National Geographic is classic and we shouldn't change it, and it's iconic. And we're going to get back to people collecting yellow magazines in their basement. And so the famous David Ogilvy quote, search every town square or park, and there are no statues to committees. Steve Jobs was able to get rid of it. And so, getting to that focus is not going to be easy, because if a committee is making a decision and there's a tendency not to say no, well, the math department wants this and the history department wants that, and we'll do a little of both. We'll do a little history, we'll do a little math. They'll both be happy, and we'll look good in the deck that we're focusing on 3 things and we have consensus. That's usually not going to do it. The ability to focus or the ability to pick one or two signature experiences to bring it to life. But you have to get to that point. You have to either empower an individual or be ruthless inside and say, look, there are 10 people on this committee. We need a unanimous point of view or nothing, because getting 3 votes for each idea means you're going to do 3 ideas and do them averagely.
One of the great examples that I like is Melik Khoury up at the Unity Environmental University. When he took over 7 years ago, it had 500 students, and it was Unity College. Now, 7 years later, they've got 7,500 students. They're on their way to 10,000. He doesn't do things by committee. It's
Right.
Melik's way, but the guy's a vision. And it took a while for him to get everyone on board, but once they were, the place has gone gangbusters. And I know you've done some work with them.
Exactly. And committees are great because if you use them right, which is get everyone's input early, get their opinions, but don't then say, well, what do you guys want to do? You have to then say, I've listened to you all. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. But after careful, we are going to go north. And here's how we're going to do it.
And to be able to do this, you've got to get out of the bubble of higher ed. You've also got to figure out, one, you've got to see what other people are doing, go a different thing. I just had an inquiry about someone wanting to get their archaeological digs certified, get it accredited, and there isn't anything out there. And the person came back to me, well, that tells me we have an opportunity. It's like, yes, that's what you've got to be thinking about.
Right. Pick something. If you're following the leader, it's a challenge. So while the answer often comes from within, it's already something you're doing and you're just going to focus on it and make it much better. If you can come up with a territory that's less overgrown, archaeology or something else, as long as it's relevant, because the trick is if it's really different and we have the best hang gliding program in the country, that's different, but it's not that relevant. So part of this is balancing both different, but it has to matter. But you're better off with something more different that matters to a few less people than something that's relevant to everybody that's completely non-different, which is where most people end up.
It's got to be unique. It's got to be relevant. It's got to be meaningful, and it's got to serve a need that is not being fulfilled.
Exactly. The other challenging piece, I hate to be Mr. Negative, is if you ask